Hello and welcome. This is the second part of the floating exercises that we started in week 7. This week I'm just going to do a little bit of review, and then we're going to talk about how we clear floats. We touched on it a little bit in week 7. Then issues related to what's called the collapsing parent and how do we deal with that? What are some workarounds? To begin with, just a little review. I have created basically the same thing that we were looking at last week, just some different colors, but in essence, it's the same thing. So we have this header that contains just the words floats review. Then we have 3 boxes. I did 3 instead of 4, but we have 3 boxes and a footer, and you can see this pale colored piece in the background. That is our main. So let's just go take a look at the code real quick. So here is exactly what I said that we have. Here is our header. Then we have main that contains each of the boxes. And we have a footer. The way that this is portrayed right now is the natural flow, what HTML wants to do when you don't use any floats. And so in week 7, you got some exercise floating left and right and seeing what would happen with those boxes. So I just thought I would go over just a little bit of review. To do this, I'm using a tool in Firefox called Firebug. You are more than welcome to install this. It's a handy little tool for, well, the reason it's Firebug is it's designed to help you debug code, but it also works really well for development. You do need to use Firefox for this. There are versions for Safari, and I believe there might be a version for Chrome. I haven't tested out the one in Chrome. The one in Safari I don't like as well. So I'm using this one in Firefox. It's an extension, so like I say, feel free to go ahead and install this. But what I've done is I've opened it up. That's what we see along the bottom. And on the left-hand side here, it shows us the code for our page. And on the right-hand side, it shows us the CSS that applies to whatever element we have selected. So there's a couple different ways that we can select elements. One is we can use this tool right here, and we can highlight over it, and you'll notice the blue box that appears, and then down below in the code it's highlighting where that particular element is in the code. So then I can go ahead and click on it, and now that it's clicked on the right-hand box down here, I can see the styles that are applied to it. So I can see that there's a background color, there's a width, then there's a border radius, the text color, and a height and a padding applied to it. The other thing is, the reason I'm doing this is because we can actually highlight right over, like in this case, this word div, and it's going to highlight in the box up above what that box looks like. And in this case, the purple represents the padding that we've given it. And this has a 10 pixel padding. And then the light blue shows the area of the actual box. So this is the part that's the 33% and is 100 pixels tall. So think back to the box method. And we can go ahead and do this. So for main, you can see that covers that whole area. Header, we also have a padding applied to that, and that covers the whole width. So this is in essence what our HTML flow is going to be. And we know from last week that we can alter that by using floats. So let's go ahead and add some floats to these boxes. And I'm going to do it right here in Firebug because it affects it locally here, and you're going to be able to see it on the screen. So I'm going to go into box 1, and I'm going to give it a float of right. And you'll see that it goes over there, and box 2 comes up. Likewise, then if I go into box 2, I can give that one a float. And if I also give that one a float of right, it's going to populate in. And because these are all 33%, it's going to fill in. But notice there is some overlap because we're losing box 3's kind of rounded edge. And part of that is because if you remember the box model, let me go over this one. So there's box 3. You can see how it is actually there, but it is underneath box 2. And it's because each of them has been set to 33% plus 10 pixels of padding on both the right and the left. So we would actually have to reduce that percentage in order to make it fit better. So for example, let's just start playing with some numbers. I'm going to do 30%, and that's on box 2. So now this is box 2 and box 3. So let's go change it for each of these boxes. I'm going to change each of them to 30%. And let's see, box 3, 30%. And now you can see there it is. They're not overlapping anymore. But in this case, box 1 and box 2 have a float right added to them. And box 3 has populated up right below the header because it still is within the normal flow of our HTML. Let's go mess with this a little bit further. I'm going to go up into my header, so I'm just clicking on header here, and I can see what styles. Header does not have a float, which is why box 1 and 2 do not bump up here when I say float right. But watch what happens if I add a float to my header. And I'm going to add a float left. Notice everything bumps up because it's messed with the normal flow of things. So now our heading 1 only encapsulates the area with the text instead of going all the way across the page, and we've told it to float left. Notice that box 3, because it still considers itself within the normal flow, bumped all the way up into, let's go find box 3, up and to the left, and then the text, because it can't fit right over the words floats review, it sits right outside of that box, but it's still within that box 3. So what happens if we give box 3 a float? Because it's the only one that doesn't. So let's give it a float left and see what happens. Oh, we're really messing things up now. So here's our header. It has a float left, but then all of a sudden, that's our footer that's showing up right there. And our footer, while it extends all the way across, it's behind everything because if we look in the flow of our HTML, it's at the bottom of the screen, it goes header, main, footer. So it's at the bottom, so it's underneath everything, but it bumps up that text and the background color because it says, oh, there's a gap here because boxes 1 and 2 have been floated right, and so boxes 1 and 2 are filling up this area up here. It leaves a gap right here because now box 3 we said float left, so it has to go underneath that floats review. So let's see if we can fix this a little bit. The first thing is with our header, if we actually remove that float again, so I'm just going to go into my code and remove that float, it's gone. All right, so now what's happened is everything, because there is no float that's been assigned to this header, it says I'm in the natural flow of things, so anything that has a float has to be applied after it. So in that case, our box 1, 2, and 3 have all been given floats of different directions. Boxes 1 and 2 have been floated right, and so then we have box 1 and then 2. And box 3 has been floated left, but again, there's this little gap because now they're 30%, 30 times 3, even with the 10 pixels on each side, it still leaves a little bit of gap. And so the footer, again, it squishes up here. That's when last week we applied that clear to our footer. And I'm going to go into clear a little bit more, but for right now, let's just add clear both, and now it bumps down behind. Now, one of the other things that you're going to notice, now that we've got this back in some semblance of an order, and all 3 of these have had floats applied to them, and we have this gap here, is you can see that that's white. Now remember, when we didn't have any floats applied to box 3, 2, or 1, and so let's go actually clear those floats so that they go into the normal flow, there's our kind of pinkish background that we have. That's the main. So if we go to main, and it says we have this background color that's this kind of pinky salmon color, it disappears in these areas where it's all floated. So if I go back to box 1 and add that float back in, so I'll just float it right again, notice this turns white. Well, what's happening here is what's referred to as a collapse of the parent. Let's think about what that means. So I have this graphic that nicely illustrates what is happening. If this little outline is the parent, so that would be main, and I'll explain what a parent is in just a moment. But say this is our main in our example, and this would be box 1, 2, 3, and in this case there'd be a box 4 floated, which means then the height of this all but pretty much collapses or disappears because none of the elements are following the normal flow of HTML. So in order to fix that, there are some different things that we can do. But let's first talk about what a parent is. So I'm going to go back to the code. So here we are in our code. Using that example, what's happening is this main is collapsing. It is the parent because it contains each of these elements. So box 1, box 2, and box 3 can be considered its children. And some of how we know that is if we come down, if you're in Dreamweaver, that gives us a nice little peek at this. We're clicked on box 3, the div for box 3. So that's what's highlighted here. And this gives us the structure of how it works up through the site. So div class box 3 is a child of main, and main technically is a child of body because main is contained within the body. So just as this h1 in our header would be a child of header, these divs for our boxes are the children and main is the parent. So that's what's happening if we go out here. We can't see it, but main is there. It's just collapsed. And we know it's there because it says so in the code. If we were to give main a height, we would actually see it is there. See, I've given it a height of 100 pixels. It is here, but there's still this white because these boxes go beyond what that parent is because they have all had floats applied to them. So I'm going to remove this height. We don't need it. One of the things that we can do is we can give that parent a float. So I'm going to go into main. Main does not have a float, but by giving it one, and I'm just going to float it left. It doesn't have a width, but it's now reclaimed this space and is containing those boxes. So if I give it also a width, and I'm just going to say 100%. We're going to claim that whole thing. Now you can see how this spreads out and we have that pinkish background. So it has reclaimed that space. So I have given it a width of 100 and I've floated this. So that's one way that we can tackle this. Another, and this we actually do need to go into the code. So I'm getting rid of that float and that width. And I'm going to go back to our code. If we go in here and we create within the main, we're going to create a blank div, because remember, a div is just an empty box. And I'm going to give it an inline style of clear both. Remember I said this is empty, so it opens and it closes, and there's nothing in between it. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we're going to go back out to the browser. Okay, so we're back out on the browser, and we can see we have this pink background, because what we've done is now with main, we've added this little div that says clear both. But because that div exists there and it's part of the natural flow, and the reason it's part of the natural flow is we're saying clear those floats that are above it. And because it's empty, we don't actually see it. We could go in here and give it some text. Actually, I think I need to go back to the code to do that. That's one of the things. So we could actually say, just to show that it's here, this is the div. I'm going to save it. And now we're back here in the browser, and here's where that little div is, where we typed in the text, and it says this is the div. So it was there, it existed, but because we said clear, it means forget about this, everything that says float left and right, and go back into the normal flow of things. So that's one way that we can do this. I'm going to go back into our code and we're going to remove that because I want to show you another way. So that's one way that you can clear it if you're having that problem, clear that collapse. The other is a method called overflow. Okay, here we are back. I got rid of that little div. It's no longer down here. And so now this is white again because our main parent has collapsed. So what we can do is go into the main style. So I'm just going to do that right out here, and it's called overflow. Now there are some options in overflow. There's auto and inherit, and we're going to ignore those because auto pretty much, or default, it just does the default setting. Inherit is kind of the same thing. It picks up what was ever defined before that. But then there's visible, scroll, and hidden. And what happens with when you do visible is it can tend to overlap the overflow, and the text overwrites each other and the boxes overwrite each other, and we don't like that, so we're not going to do that. Scroll inserts some scroll bars, so it'll contain it within that width, but it'll give you scroll bars so you can see it. That's a little annoying, but it can be useful depending on your situation. The one we're going to do is called hidden, and what hidden basically says is overflow that area and reclaims that space, but it doesn't necessarily overwrite that text. So notice I put in the word hidden and our main is back. So it's right there. This overflow hidden method, one caution, it wasn't designed specifically to clear floats, but it's become one that's really commonly used. But occasionally you might run into some issues with it. For the most part, this is the one that I tend to use. It's what a lot of web designers and developers use. There is another one out there called ClearFix, and we're not going to go into that. It kind of goes beyond the scope of what we're covering in this class. However, if you're interested in using it, by all means go out to W3 Schools, take a look, and play around with it. The other fix, so if overflow hidden doesn't quite work, or adding the float left or float right of our main with a width applied to it, if that's one method. Another method, of course, is this overflow hidden, and the other method is to add that additional empty div tag that says clear. So then on that note, what on earth about clearing? What it does is it basically reintroduces the flow of our HTML to kind of the natural order. And there are three options that we have, and I'm going to do just a little altering just so we can get a better idea of this. I'm going to reduce these boxes down even further, our box 1, 2, and 3, just so that we can make sure that our footer gets plenty of room. I'm just giving a 20% each instead of 30. And if you recall correctly, our footer earlier, we added this clear. So I'm just going to get rid of it. I also need to go up into my main because we did this overflow hidden. So I'm going to get rid of that. What's happening here is our footer has said, okay, well, the normal flow is floats. This is the normal flow because there isn't a float or anything applied to it, so it's just up in the top left. The next thing is it wants to go, that if it doesn't have a float applied to it, it too wants to go up right underneath the one right before it and right up to the left. Well, the text can't get there, but if you look, let's highlight this, our footer goes all the way across from left to right. But the text has to kind of work its way around that box 3 that's there. So that's why it's kind of in the middle. Well, what we can do is we can apply that clear and say move out and around these boxes. And that gets applied to the element that we want to clear. So in this case, we want to clear or move that footer. So I'm going to bring this back, but we have some options. We have clear left, which actually clears anything that's been floated to the left, and it means it has to go underneath it. So in this case, that would be our box 3. But what happens if we change the height of our box 3? Because right now, all 3 of these boxes are the same height. So you're seeing that it pushes down here, but it doesn't really make a difference. So let's go and add a height to box 3, because that's the one that's floated left, and we're only clearing the left side. So I'm going to change this to 50 pixels, and see, now it's only 50 pixels, but it says on the footer, clear left. So it's only clearing what is on the left-hand side. It's not clearing what's on the right. So let's go flip that. Let's now say clear right. And now it jumps back down again because it needs to clear what's been told to float right. All of this being said, the one that is most common is the one I introduced you to in class 7 and we used earlier in this video, which is clear both. And that simply means to clear any floats to the left and any floats to the right that are above it and reestablish the flow, because there is no float that's actually applied to this footer. So the reason it's done this is it's cleared the left, so it's not bumped up here, but it also has to clear the right, and so it needs to go directly beneath that. So that's how we clear something. So why do we care about floats? Well, floats allow us to do layouts, and they give us the building blocks to create a site. So for example, using just these basic blocks, if we imagine box 1 as an image banner that we want across the top, we can give this a width of 100%. Actually, in this case, because of our padding, we're going to give it like a 98% and see how far that goes. There we go. So we're going to say make that 98%, and it's plus the 10 padding. So it's going to come close to filling it up. But say this is our banner. And so we're also going to give it a height that's a little bit bigger, say 200 pixels. And then underneath that, we're going to make a couple of other elements that would be, for example, a couple columns forming our text. So box 2, let's go into that, and let's give it a width of, say, 65%. We want it to be about 2/3. And so we're going to float that left, and then our box 3, we're going to float that right and leave it at 30, and it's going to leave a nice little margin in between there automatically. So now what's happened is this is going to form the basis of our website. If we go in and add the wrapper that we've done, so let's go back to our code and let's add these things into our code. So I'm going to go back. Let's add a wrapper. So I'm in the HTML, div ID wrapper, and that's right inside the body tag, and we're going to go down right in before the body tag closes, and I'm going to leave myself a comment, and I'm just going to say this closes the wrapper. So I know what that div is doing. Then I'm going to go into my CSS, and we're going to create that new wrapper style, and I'm going to just do that right up near the top, and we're going to open and close that. I'm going to give this a width, and I'm going to give it a width of, say, 80%, because I'm going to keep this in percentages. Percentages allow us to be a lot more fluid. And then if you remember, we do margin left. We've been doing this a few times. And margin right, auto. And this will allow us to center. So there we go. We'll save that. And now I'm going to go in and let's see, what did we also change? We did our box 1. We can actually, I'm going to put this in at 100% now and see what happens. And actually, I'm going to remove the padding. So I'm going to change this so that it doesn't apply to all 3 of the boxes. And I will put it in here. We'll still leave the padding on box 2 and the padding on box 3. And we're going to change the width of box 2. We set that to 65%, and changing box 3, we left that to 30, but we changed it to float right so that it had a little bit of built-in margin. So let's see what happens now. So I'm going to save this, and this is what an example of a potential layout would look like. And now to test to see how many of you are still watching this for an additional 5 extra credit, I want you to go out and we are going to replace this blue box with an image of a cat. I don't care which cat. So I'm just going to go out and do a Google search, and I'd already been out here. I pulled down this image. You can pick any image that you would like and then save it into your web folder. So for example, here's mine saved in here. I just called it cats. Make sure that you size it appropriately for the horizontal, because we're going to replace our banner. And here it is in Photoshop. I've gone in and I've done some cropping and stuff just to make it an appropriate banner for this. Then go back into your code. Let's go in and change. This is all in box 1. So what I want you to do then is go in and add a background image, which we've done before. And you can go ahead and browse. In my case, it's this one called cats. And you're going to notice that if you just put it in without a height, because actually I'm just going to leave this and I'm going to save it. Now let's go out to the browser and let's refresh this. You're going to see I just get this little tiny piece, and it's because I haven't given this any height beyond what we gave to all of our boxes. So let's go back to the code and see there was this height that was applied to boxes 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to just change the height for just the box 1. So height, and I happen to know my image is 390 pixels tall, so I'm going to put in that height. And the other thing I better do is background image, or actually it'd be background repeat, none or no repeat, because we don't want this to repeat even if it starts filling out. So I'm going to save this. So this was updating my CSS. I didn't do anything with the HTML, but now I'll have this image and it'll look more like a banner that you would see on a website. So let's go back out to the browser. So here is what it now looks like. So it still says floats review, it still has the rounded edges, we still have the 2 boxes that are there, but you earn the 5 extra credit points if you include a background image of some sort of cats, since the internet is filled with cats. Have fun with this. Thanks for staying tuned. So for example, then we have our header. We would have a banner image. We would have a column with some text. We'd have another narrow column with some text. So this is just an example of how we use these floats. So hopefully you've been able to follow along and figure out some of these elements.